In 1983, a nearly broke immigrant living above a Jaguar repair shop built a piece of software that sold for $49.95, and it was so good, so fast, that Microsoft itself reportedly had an internal rallying cry among engineers, "Kill Philippe." That company grew into one of the most respected software brands of the entire personal computer era. Its tools trained a generation of programmers. Its mascot appeared on manuals millions of people owned. 26 years later, it was quietly absorbed into a British company most consumers had never heard of, its name reduced to a line item in an acquisition announcement. This is Borland, a company that arguably built better products than its competitors for over a decade and still lost, largely because of decisions it made to itself. Unlike a lot of the companies we cover, this one doesn't have a single villain or a single moment of fraud. It has something almost more uncomfortable, a series of genuinely brilliant engineers repeatedly making strategic decisions that actively worked against them. This is the story of Borland. Welcome back to Boardroom Ruins, where we dig into the companies that built entire industries and then watched those industries move on without them. If you've been here before, you know how this goes. No fluff, no filler, just the real decisions, the real numbers, and the real moments where it all started to come apart. If you're new, consider this your warning. Once you start seeing how these collapses actually happen, you start noticing the same patterns everywhere. Hit subscribe now because you're going to want to see the next one. All right, back to the story.
The real origin actually starts in Denmark in August 1981, where three Danish citizens, Niels Jensen, Ole Henriksen, and Mogens Glad, built early software tools for the CP/M operating system under the name Borland Limited. They quickly realized something important. To actually reach the American market, they needed an American company and an American face. At a trade show in San Francisco, they met Philippe, a French engineer who'd recently moved to Silicon Valley, arrived with almost nothing, and was, by his own account, too financially strapped at the time to even buy a car for his family. In 1983, Kahn became president, CEO, and chairman of the newly formed Borland International, run out of a rented office above an actual Jaguar repair shop in Scotts Valley, California. Kahn liked to joke he was starting the company the American way, in a garage. Kahn's first real insight was almost embarrassingly simple in hindsight. At the time, the market for programming languages and developer tools was completely neglected. Everyone else was chasing spreadsheets and word processors. Almost nobody was paying serious attention to languages. So Borland built Turbo Pascal, a compiler and development environment for the Pascal programming language, written by a young engineer named Anders Hedsberg, who would later go on to create C# and TypeScript for Microsoft. Turbo Pascal launched in November 1983, priced at just $49.95, a fraction of what professional development tools typically cost. It was also remarkably fast and deliberately designed to run in under 64 kilobytes of memory, a genuinely difficult engineering constraint Kahn insisted on. It was an immediate hit, especially with hobbyists, students, and professional developers alike. In 1984, Borland followed it with Sidekick, a desktop utility offering a calendar, notepad, and calculator that could be summoned instantly with a hotkey, even while another program was running. Sidekick sold over 1 million copies in its first 3 years. Through the mid to late 1980s, Borland kept expanding its lineup, Turbo C in 1987, Turbo Prolog, Turbo Basic, building a genuine reputation among developers as the company that made powerful tools accessible and affordable rather than locked behind enterprise pricing. Borland's rivalry with Microsoft during this era became genuinely legendary within the industry. Borland's aggressive pricing and superior technical performance put real pressure on Microsoft's own competing products, reportedly serious enough that "Kill Philippe" became something of an internal rallying cry among Microsoft engineers at the time. In 1987, Borland acquired ANSA Software, the maker of the Paradox database, for $38 million, its first major acquisition, and a genuinely sound one, expanding Borland's reach beyond just programming languages into the database market. Kahn took the company public via an IPO on the London Stock Exchange in 1986, followed by additional stock offerings in the US in 1989 and 1991. Under his leadership, Borland grew from zero revenue without venture capital funding to a $500 million annual run rate, a genuinely remarkable achievement for a company that started above a repair shop.
Then, in 1991, Borland made the acquisition that would define its next decade, and not in a good way. Borland acquired Ashton Tate, the maker of DBase, one of the biggest and most established names in software at the time, for $440 million. On paper, it looked like a bold, category-defining move, instantly making Borland the dominant force in PC databases. In practice, Ashton Tate was already a struggling company by the time Borland bought it, and absorbing it put severe financial strain on Borland's balance sheet. Around the same time, Borland launched Quattro Pro, its own spreadsheet product, igniting a fierce, expensive price war against Lotus 123 and Microsoft Excel, a fight Borland was competing in on multiple fronts simultaneously against well-funded rivals while still digesting an oversized acquisition. Fighting Microsoft on spreadsheets, Lotus on spreadsheets, and integrating a financially troubled $440 million acquisition all at the same time was, in hindsight, an enormous amount of strategic weight for one company to carry at once. The financial and strategic strain came to a head in January 1995. After disagreements with Borland's board over the company's direction, Philippe was forced to resign as CEO. He remained on the board as a director for a period afterward, but the man who had built Borland from nothing, personally, was no longer running it. What followed, by most accounts from people who worked there, was a loss of the clear technical vision Kahn had provided. New leadership struggled to maintain the company's innovation pace, or to adapt quickly enough to a software market that was shifting rapidly beneath them, particularly as Microsoft's Visual Studio and later the .NET platform began offering developers an integrated, all-in-one alternative that was difficult for a single-purpose tools company to compete against. Then, in 1998, Borland made a decision that many longtime observers still consider one of the strangest self-inflicted wounds in the company's history. Under CEO Delbert Yoakum, a former Apple executive, Borland hired a branding agency to rename the company entirely, abandoning the Borland name, one of the most recognized and respected brands in software development, in favor of a new name, Enprise, meant to evoke integrating the enterprise. The strategic idea behind the rename wasn't necessarily unreasonable. Borland was trying to reposition itself around enterprise software integration following its acquisition of Viginex software. But the execution damaged the company badly. According to accounts from the time, the rename was so disorienting to the market that many customers and observers reportedly assumed Borland had simply gone out of business. The company had, in effect, voluntarily erased the single most valuable asset it had built over 15 years, its own name, right as it needed customer trust the most. Borland reversed the decision and changed the name back in 2001, but 3 years of confused branding, during a period when Microsoft was aggressively consolidating the developer tools market, is not time a struggling company can easily get back. The strategic reversals kept coming. In 2000, with a wave of community enthusiasm behind the move, Borland made its Interbase database open source, a genuinely popular decision among developers. Then, a couple of years later, the company reversed course again, pulling Interbase back into proprietary development. By then, the open source community had already forked the code into a new independent project, Firebird, which went on to thrive precisely because Borland had walked away from its own open source commitment. In 2002, Borland acquired TogetherSoft for roughly $185 million, notably more money than Micro Focus would eventually pay to acquire the entirety of what remained of Borland years later. Eventually, Borland made one final strategic pivot, spinning off its own core developer tools, the products like Delphi and JBuilder that had actually built the company's reputation in the first place, into a separate division called CodeGear, which was later sold off entirely to Embarcadero Technologies. Borland had over roughly a decade renamed itself away from its own identity, reversed its own open-source strategy, overpaid for at least 2 major acquisitions, and finally sold off the very products that made it famous, keeping whatever was left over. What remained of Borland limped forward through the 2000s as a smaller, less distinct company, reporting around $172 million in revenue by 2008, with roughly 1,100 employees, a fraction of its former scale and relevance. In 2009, Borland became a full subsidiary of Micro Focus International, a British software firm, effectively ending its run as an independent company after 26 years. The final chapter came in 2023, when Micro Focus itself, Borland included, was acquired by the Canadian firm OpenText, which absorbed whatever remained of Borland's product portfolio into its own application delivery management division. The company that once trained an entire generation of programmers on tools like Turbo Pascal and Delphi had by the end become an unlisted line item inside somebody else's acquisition filing. So what actually happened to Borland? This isn't a story about a company that lost because its products were bad, or because it got blindsided by a competitor nobody saw coming. For most of the 1980s and well into the 1990s, Borland's engineering was genuinely excellent, often better than Microsoft's own tools, at a fraction of the price. What actually happened is harder to accept in some ways than a simple villain or a single scandal. A company with real technical talent kept making strategic decisions that worked directly against its own interests. An oversized, financially straining acquisition. A multi-front price war it didn't need to fight simultaneously. A rebrand that erased its own most valuable asset. A reversal of its own open-source promise that handed a thriving alternative to a rival project for free. Individually, maybe any one of these survives. Stacked together over about a decade, they didn't. There's a real lesson sitting inside Borland's story, and it's a less comfortable one than the market changed or a bigger competitor crushed them. Sometimes the biggest threat to a genuinely brilliant company isn't the competition at all. It's a boardroom that keeps confidently choosing the wrong next move, one reasonable sounding decision at a time. If you found this one interesting, we've also covered other companies that had the talent to win and still didn't. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.